Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this, welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody. That is hopefully for somebody. My name is Cal Narandia, and welcome to episode 149. And on this week's episode of the podcast, I am going to be reviewing the live-action remake of How to Train Your Dragon. Is it a little early for only a 15-year-old movie to get a live-action remake? You will find out in this week's episode. As usual, there will be a non-spoiler section as well as a spoiler section. Time codes will be listed in the description, so there's no need to worry. Let's jump into my non-spoiler thoughts on How to Train Your Dragon 2025.
Toothless. I could have sworn you had teeth. I don't have any more.
The How to Train Your Dragon live-action remake presented me with an interesting experience that is unlike the experience I've had with all of the Disney live-action remakes, which is DreamWorks, of course, is a much younger studio, and it was founded by Jeffrey Katzenberg and Steven Spielberg. I couldn't tell you exactly when, but it's a relatively newer studio compared to something like Disney. Jeffrey Katzenberg actually worked at Disney and was in charge of animation, eventually starting DreamWorks with Steven Spielberg, as I already said. And all of the live-action remakes, for the most part, have been films I'm very familiar with, grew up with during their major release, or had on VHS in clamshells or whatnot growing up as a kid. So those movies I was incredibly familiar with. That's not to say that I'm not familiar with the How to Train Your Dragon films. I've seen all three, and I was joking with a friend of mine that it really bothers me. We have the Blu-ray set where it's How to Train Your Dragon, How to Train Your Dragon 2, and then How to Train Your Dragon The Hidden World, because that was released in an era where marketers and studio heads were afraid of using numbers, so they would put in a subtitle to convince people to come and see it, so that way, if they hadn't seen the two previous ones, that they would be all right. I think that's incredibly stupid, but regardless, here we are. And How to Train Your Dragon came out in 2010 or 2010. I was 19 when that movie came out, and of course, I saw it at some point. It wasn't one that I experienced in theaters. I have a high respect and regard for the original film. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And the sequels are well executed and well made. I think they're a little derivative of what makes the first film so great, with some character relationships and the emphasis on what's significant in those plots being very familiar. But it is a very well executed trilogy and probably one of the best from DreamWorks as an animation studio. It's particularly interesting that they are now jumping into this ship, which is live action remakes. Of course, I reviewed Snow White, and it seemed to mark an interesting turn, which is, of course, there was a lot leading into that with the reception because of things that were happening outside of the movie's control. But the tide may have turned depending on what the film is, which is particularly interesting because Lilo and Stitch, of course, was a massive success, continues to be so, only was dethroned at the international and domestic box office by How to Train Your Dragon, this appealing clearly to a generation that I am not a part of. But overall, for the most part, live-action remakes have mostly been mixed, if not poorly received by audiences and critics. Some of the best really do differentiate themselves from the animated classic. The bones are there, but you see how they decide to specifically focus on one particular aspect, whether that be two key characters like Pete's dragon, Pete and Elliot, or the Jungle Book kind of finessing the plot to be much more streamlined than a bunch of short stories, which is kind of the way that Rudyard Kipling had written Mowgli's adventures in the Jungle Book. Cinderella's almost a period piece, and then does have those small elements of magic, but also isn't a musical. Where How to Train Your Dragon is really interesting because it is a case study on something that has not happened before, which is Dean DeBlois, who is a Canadian filmmaker. I didn't know that until looking at this right now. So shout out, who was responsible as one of the directors of How to Train Your Dragon. And he is returning to How to Train Your Dragon live action. He's also credited as the screenwriter. And the experience to this, it's so difficult because the more I've talked about this, the more I have mixed feelings. And that's even, I'm doing my best to look at this movie in a vacuum, which is ideally what a critic should be doing. The hardest part with this, more than anything, is this movie is just 15 years old. I am familiar with it enough to where none of the major sequences are hard for me to remember. Partially that's due to the fact that John Powell's score for the original film is one of my favorites he's ever done. I think the musical themes used in the How to Train Your Dragon franchise are absolutely impeccable. And because of that, I know the major plot points of the movie. Of course, with remakes, you are familiar with them. But these films should be regarded on their own, but the problem is you are remaking things that are incredibly popular and people are very familiar with. You can change things, modify them slightly. An example of that, and I know it had mixed reception overall, which is fair, but Aladdin's choices with Guy Ritchie to have Will Smith be the Fresh Prince of the Lamp versus, of course, the incredible improv that Robin Williams provided in the original film. And then the third one, it was Dan Castellaneta in Return of Jafar, which was essentially a pilot for the Aladdin TV series. And by all regards and all major elements, How to Train Your Dragon 2025 is a very well put together movie. It happens to be very, very similar to the animated film. And that's the part that I struggle with the most. I am familiar with these characters. I know who they are. As somebody who is a diehard fan of animation, one of the hardest things that when you're making these live action remakes is getting the right sound for the characters. Jay Baruchel, of course, shout out another Canadian, has such a specific sound as Hiccup. And that is something that you're not going to want to do an impression of. And I believe that Mason Thames, who people would know from Black Phone, does a great job of bringing Hiccup to life in reality. The main cast in general did a really great job of establishing how these characters, without being caricatures, would function in a real world. Now, of course, this is a fantastical world, given the fact that it's Burke with a bunch of dragons, very Viking themed. And all of the production design is stupendous. And by all measures, this is a very well put together movie. It follows the story of the original very closely. And it's funny because, to me, that is to the film's detriment, because if we are remaking something, we need to change it a little just so it is not just checking plot points off or sequences or even cinematography to some regard. That is an element of animation which is so special, with how spectacle within the animation realm can be unlike anything you've ever seen before. If you go back and look at my favorite films of 2024 and then to 2023, what's so interesting to me, and I shouldn't be surprised by this, nor should listeners if you are a longtime fan of the Film Realist podcast, which is that these movies, specifically within animation, have been my favorite of the year. The Wild Robot and then Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. Animation as an art form within cinema, when it is firing on all cylinders, is the most impressive than anything you can do with people. A lot of this comes down to one of the interesting parts of these live-action remakes of animated films. I wouldn't go as far to say How to Train Your Dragon is a classic. Stephanie, I know you probably would, but I'm not talking about that right now. Those major sequences that you are so familiar with within this franchise are obviously done through animation. I don't want to burst anybody's bubbles, but dragons don't exist. So all of the CGI has to be elevated and add tangibility and practicality and look as if it could exist in the real world. And Stitch, both films, Lilo and Stitch and How to Train Your Dragon, both being co-directed by Dean DeBlois, provide an interesting challenge of adapting a character that people know incredibly well and wanting to bring a tangibility of him existing in the real world. Funnily enough, they maintain the cartoonish characteristics, whether that be the big expressive eyes and whatnot. For the most part, those character models are maintained. And these characters do look photoreal. The texturing amongst the scales and whatnot looks really great. None of that looks as if it couldn't really exist outside of maybe the cartoonish eyes. But again, it allows the characters to be substantially expressive. However, in order to make those sequences, you have to rely on CGI. How to Train Your Dragon is a film that was done through CGI animation as opposed to traditional 2D animation, which just means the only thing that's going to exist in those sequences is likely the people who happen to be riding on the back of the dragons, or for a bunch of these, you're going to have to use a CGI double. And the spectacle is just not going to be the same. I thought to myself after watching this movie that it would have been really funny if instead of doing this, DreamWorks Animation did what Naughty Dog has done with the Last of Us franchise, which is just remaster the animation elements and make them more detailed, allow 4K probably to be included, and maybe even up the frame rate. And you could just sell people the same movie. Because if I'm being totally honest, they just happen to do that now with live action people. Could this be an access point for people who are unfamiliar with this franchise? I don't really know, because the overall box office release for this did surprisingly well, pulling in 197 worldwide, 83 domestically, which is not nothing, especially in post-COVID filmgoer audiences. And this is definitely going to wind up making money. A sequel to this has already been greenlit. All of the elements in this work, looking at the film purely on its own, and there's a lot to talk about with this, which is why I chose to have this part of the conversation within the non-spoiler section. Apologies if you wanted more of an overall review, but let's get more into the cast now, which I'm hoping you're looking forward to hearing about. Nico Parker continues some really interesting performances, coming off of Sarah Miller in The Last of Us, and now bringing her own perspective to Astrid, that independent fighter who's so driven and focused to do what she wants to do, which is become the best dragon fighter amongst their age range, and how her relationship with Hiccup develops does really work. I think the chemistry between those two is substantially important given where their relationship goes down the line. Gerard Butler returning to the role of Stoic. He's not nearly as cartoonishly wide, but that being an actor who so perfectly captured his voice of Stoic and bringing that into live action, I'm glad that they did that. I liked Nick Frost as Gobber, something I thought that would have been really cool going to another Dean DeBlois film with the live action remake of Lilo and Stitch. I thought it would have been really cool to maybe have David Tennant or Craig Ferguson show up as cameos of random people in Burke, just to sort of see them in the background. I like how Lilo and Stitch had Tia Career and Jason Scott Lee as people within the world. I thought that was really fun to get them an opportunity to be a part of the movie without being the exact same characters. So maybe Craig Ferguson sits on a bench within Burke talking to a dragon skeleton, similar to how he would have done in his Late Show. In general, I think all of the friends that are also training with him that eventually become his friends, they're obviously not to start the film, fit in that perfectly exaggerated human look because of the features of the actors that they've cast, while still looking like real people. It's not cartoonish with makeup or anything, which I really appreciate. The cast for this movie is not overly large. I commend them on keeping the budget under $200 million because it allows for moderate success for this to continue, and it breaking Lilo and Stitch's run of being the #1 film for the box office is quite important, I think. If DreamWorks is, and they clearly are, dipping their toe into this live action remake realm that Disney for a while made so much money, and it's cool to see. It's weird talking about this movie because it's 15 years old, you know what happens, but still, this movie is addressing it as if you don't know. There are things that have changed that I think enhance it overall, given the hindsight they do have with having made 3 films already. So on its own, and I know I've talked around a bunch of other things that have to do with this, it's a good movie. The problem is I've seen this movie already, and unlike what I loved about some of the Disney live action remakes, this to me is kind of just down the barrel of it meets expectations, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It looks great on the big screen. If you want this CGI live action hybrid that this film is, I definitely think it's worth checking out. So that will do it for my non-spoiler thoughts on How to Train Your Dragon 2025. Now let's jump into spoilers, some of the changes I noticed, and I can address why I may have missed some of them.
Hiccup.
Dad, look, I need to talk to you, Dad.
I need to speak with you too, son.
I've
think it's
decided
time
I
you
don't
learn
want to
to
fight
fight
dragons. What?
No, you go first.
No, you go first.
You get your wish. Dragon training. Start in the morning.
Oh man, I really should have gone first.
There's definitely going to be some people who know this film incredibly well. Again, I've seen it more than once. I really like the relationship, particularly one of the things that is absolutely incredible that this movie did do is spoilers for either version of it, which is the conclusion of the film with the reveal that Hiccup has lost one of his legs, or at least portion of his leg, and now he has an artificial foot. He's a hero with accessibility. And to say that wasn't a big deal when it happened, I think would be undercutting what a substantial marker that probably is for people who are missing any limbs just in general. For the hero of the story, for one, to not be somebody who is brawn, having a character built to be all about their brain and their empathy is what makes them a hero, makes Hiccup individually amongst so many different protagonists in children's films to be a monumental achievement in demonstrating such a unique perspective. And I commend the movie on doing that, and continuing to have that message be a part of the How to Train Your Dragon universe is commendable, and I'm super pumped about that. What's interesting to me about this film, as I said in non-spoilers, is they've got 3 movies to look back on. How to Train Your Dragon 2 introduced the idea that Hiccup's mom had not actually passed away, that she was living amongst the dragons in some other location in a nest of some sort. And one of the changes that I did notice, I made a point for this movie of not re-watching the original because I didn't want to know every single sequence, even considering I knew them quite well already. And the addition of including several scenes of dialogue to establish Hiccup's mom dying because of dragons really does add the defensive and anger Stoic has towards the idea of one, Hiccup fighting dragons, and the perspective of why we need to kill them is because what they've taken from us. I think that's really important, and adding substantially more history to Stoic's relationship with dragons does matter, and it makes his transition into seeing that they are animals that were just sort of doing a job because of the alpha, as they're dubbed within this universe, does really matter. And I think that transition of his perspective is really important, particularly with your parents. Having your parents change their perspective, that's not nothing. Looking at the cast as a whole, I know I mentioned them very briefly. Mason Thames does such a good job of portraying all of the characteristics that we need from Hiccup. His physical humor works really well. The delivery of the dialogue, that's one part of it that I wish they had sort of shifted up just a little. So much of the dialogue in the screenplay is exactly the same. There are specific moments where they cut stuff, the I'm a Viking, I'm a Viking, I'm a Viking is not in the movie, which is interesting because it was a part of the marketing. But again, a lot of the dialogue you are familiar with is in the movie, and all of the actors in it do a good job of selling all of those lines. They don't feel cartoonish, which I appreciate. It's hard sometimes because going from animation to live action, there is an exaggerated nature to sometimes the way that that dialogue is acted. And that's not to say all the time. Sometimes it's required, sometimes it's not, depending on the subtlety required for those specific scenes or the moment within the movie. And all of the actors are completely believable. And for the most part, all of that works. I wouldn't say there was anything specific that stood out to me, but my experience of being familiar with this and it not being something from childhood and nostalgia, I know my perspective is going to be different than somebody else's. I've talked so many times about the live action remakes in general and kind of feeling tired with that process, specifically when it is very much the same movie. How to Train Your Dragon live action is a good movie based on a great one. Whatever ideas that worked from the original, they work here. So if you're just reviewing this movie, How to Train Your Dragon, it's a good movie. The addition of history matters. The relationships work. It's longer, which, say what you will, is good or bad. It's about 30 minutes longer. I would say overall, what I would classify as padding did sort of get felt. We get more time with the characters, which is not a bad thing. But animated films typically are perfectly in that 100-minute to hour and a half length, and this movie is over 2 hours. I didn't necessarily feel that everything added to it was substantial, but even with that being said, How to Train Your Dragon live action it manages to deliver the same emotional story, the spectacle you would expect with adapting this animated film to live action does work. They capture the feeling of that movie, whether that be because John Powell came back as the composer, but all of the actors bring those characters to life with a relative nuance in live action, and they sell those characters. They're just as funny, they're very entertaining, and these relationships are ones I enjoy seeing performed in animation and now into live action. How to Train Your Dragon as a live action film works because you're building off of a great movie. It clearly is one of those movies that is very close to what we appreciate about the original, and that may be good for some. It may not be, because you expecting and knowing exactly what's going to happen to the exact angle of cinematography, that's a pro and a con for some people. Or it might be, I love the original and I'm glad you changed absolutely nothing. It's a really interesting movie to talk about, and I'd be very curious what the listeners had to say about it. So that will do it for my non-spoiler review of How to Train Your Dragon. Let's jump into question of the week responses.
Can I ask you a question?
Just fun?
There's something I've been meaning to ask you.
I ask the questions, you answer the questions.
Why do you ask questions to which you already know the answers?
Did that count as a question?
Yes. Damn it.
Last week's question of the week was, what is your favorite movie with dragons? Let's see what the listeners had to say. Jermaine, question of the week. My favorite movie with a dragon was a visionary masterpiece by the very creative director Zack Snyder. No way you would ever think you would see a dragon in the same movie as a World War scene with zombies, and it would make sense. All while making people aware of mental health issues. It launched the career of Oscar Isaac and Vanessa Hudgens. Did it, Jermaine? You might be overlooking a trilogy of High School Musical films. That film, if you have to ask, is Sucker Punch. Okay, Jermaine, you know what? I was not expecting this to be one of the answers, but I'm super glad you maintained your individuality. First time comment from C. Clayton. I ended up loving this film enough it got me into the John Wick franchise. So this is, of course, referring to Ballerina from the world of John Wick. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you're listening to this episode to hear me respond to your comment. Scotty Cameron, Kyle's question. Let there be dragons. Oh, wait. Dragons were just a metaphor in that film. Red Dragon. Wait, that is a film about a serial killer who thinks he's the great red dragon of William Blake's painting. Enough joking around. It's Lord of the Rings trilogy. The Witch King rode a dragon. Okay, I appreciate all the metaphor. And Scotty, to be fair, it could have been a metaphor. You could have just left it at Red Dragon. I know how much you love the Silence of the Lambs franchise. So you could have done that. I didn't say it had to be real dragons. And then Scotty continues Dylan's question. Saw is a franchise that I wish didn't have a spinoff because Spiral's existence actively frustrates me. Okay. Legacy Odinson writes, Ballerina ended up being a total blast. I may have walked away with 2 or 3 small gripes. One being too nuanced for 450 character comment, and that being I didn't necessarily think the movie needed a Wick fight scene since the movie had already won me over by the time it happened. Still utterly fantastic. Question of the week response. Well, I reckon I'd have to say Spirited Away. I was going to joke and say Dragon Ball Evolution, though. I'm glad you didn't Legacy because Dragon Ball Evolution is absolutely terrible. Dylan writes in, favorite movie with dragons? I guess Mulan? Most dragon movies aren't that good, I guess. Pete's Dragon 2. And then Melissa Lutz 219 writes in Aragon. Interesting. There's a bunch of variety in that, and I really appreciate that from all of the listeners. Next week's episode's actually going to be 2 reviews, but because one of them is 28 years later, and I don't believe I've asked this yet, so if I have, forgive me, but I looked back into my notes, and I don't have it written down yet. So, this week's question of the week is, what is your favorite franchise that focuses on zombies? That can be a television series, a series of films, maybe a comic book series. I'm really looking forward to seeing what people have to say because there is such a wide variety of this. If you really want to include The Last of Us, even though they're technically clickers, I would accept that. If you would like to answer question of the week, you can comment below on YouTube and Spotify. You can email the podcast, filmreelistspod@gmail.com, or you can comment on the social media post that includes the question of the week, which usually goes live Thursdays or Fridays. I do look at all of the social media reactions to the podcast stuff on socials. The podcast is on everything. So thank you to everybody who sends in their questions as well as their answers to question of the week. If you haven't yet, please consider following the podcast and leaving a 5-star review. If you write one on Apple Podcasts, I will read it. We do have 2. This one is 5 stars, says for a somebody. Kyle and the guests he brings on the show have such an enthusiasm for what they are talking about that I can't help but listen, even if I haven't seen the movie or TV show. And the other one that was from Danny Cav25. The next one is from Donnie963, titled Informative. I know nothing about movies, and thankfully I enjoy Kyle and his guests' informative banter. Thank you everybody who has submitted their review on your favorite podcast platform. As said at the beginning of Question of the Week, next week's episode is going to be a review of Elio, the latest Pixar film, and 28 Years Later. So there's a children's film, a family-friendly film, or a horror long-awaited sequel. I'm hoping one of those reviews is something you're going to want to hear me react to, so make sure you are following the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. My name is Kyle Naranya, and I will see you next time.